I have to start with some other breaking news that I didn't also have on the agenda. Republican Congresswoman and conservative firebrand Marjorie Taylor Greene has just announced that she will resign from Congress and leave office on January 5th, basically a full year before the end of her term. The announcement comes just after the longtime MAGA diehard publicly broke with the president over the Epstein files, which she fought to make public alongside House Democrats. Tonight, Congresswoman Greene made clear that was a factor in her decision.
Standing up for American women who were raped at 14 years old, trafficked and used by rich, powerful men should not result in me being called a traitor and threatened by the President of the United States, whom I fought for. I have too much self-respect and dignity. I love my family way too much, and I do not want my sweet district to have to endure a hurtful and hateful primary against me by the President that we all fought for, only to fight and win my election while Republicans will likely lose the midterms, and in turn be expected to defend the president against impeachment after he hatefully dumped tens of millions of dollars against me and tried to destroy me. It's all so absurd and completely unserious. I refuse to be a battered wife, hoping it all goes away and gets better.
I refuse to be a battered wife, hoping it all goes away and gets better. Starting us off tonight is MS Now senior White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, who's been covering Marjorie Taylor Greene for a long time. Vaughn, she put out a statement, put out on X, and that video statement, I think they matched each other, says a lot of stuff in there. What's your sense of what motivated her decision to announce her retirement?
The fact that she used the word cult-like when suggesting that that is the state of political parties in Washington, D.C., because, you know, I think then when folks think about the magnification of the Republican Party, one of the first faces that they see is Marjorie Taylor Greene. But when, you know, this evolution of the Republican Party under Donald Trump's here second term, there were a couple occasions in which she sought to step outside the lines of the decisions that were being made out of the White House. And effectively, as she indicates here in this video, that Speaker Johnson was unwilling to even bring up a great many bills to the floor that she was partly responsible for introducing, that she felt like fell in line with that MAGA agenda. But this is where sort of I think that we are in Washington, D.C., especially around the idea that there's sort of this a lame duck presidency that is awaiting President Trump, most likely sooner than later. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is cognizant of that. And this is for a few more months, they will have majorities in the Senate and the House. And some of the key major policy initiatives that she wanted to push up on Capitol Hill, they have effectively been blocked. And I think that that is where, you know, the midterm elections, she feels like from the government shutdown to the Epstein debacle over the releasing of these files, that those two issues have run afoul of what the party is effectively able to represent. And so I think now it's a question of, are there others like Marjorie Taylor Greene step out, because I think she was anticipating a bigger coalition coming to her defense, but that's not what she got.
Yeah, and it's sort of in the middle of her statement where she talks about the Epstein stuff. Her break with Donald Trump about this has been very public, and people have talked about it a lot. But if listening to her interviews over the last month or so, it's not just the Epstein stuff. She's taken issue with House Republican leadership over this matter that Democrats were complaining about, the extension of the Affordable Care Act subsidies. She said she's been getting constituent calls about rural health care, about ACA subsidies. It sounded like she's had it on a lot of fronts.
Right. And she's mentioned tariffs are another example.
Yep. That
ultimately it's, you know, the consumers, it's people in her congressional district in Georgia that are paying the cost of it. And it runs perpendicular to the message that in 2024, they went and conveyed to constituents back home. And you can say an awful lot of things about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her political career. We have all watched up close from January 6th in her defense to this day of the pardons for those that were a part of the attack. And I think that that is where I think it is difficult to even place not just political figures, but more so people on the ground into boxes of ideologies here today. Ali, I know you and I have had extensive conversations about this, and I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, in a wild way, is representative of not a both sides America, but one in which, you know, if you go and talk to pretty much anybody, including viewers watching here tonight, they're on a myriad of issues. People have a different understanding and different lived experience and different things that compel them to politics and to particular candidates. And what you have heard from Marjorie Taylor Greene and from me talking with people close to her over the last weeks was sort of a disgust, a sadness, and a frustration that those within the party, the Republican Party, including Donald Trump, did not rally to her defense, or not even just rally to her defense, but they went on to attack her. I mean, Donald Trump calling her a traitor. And I think it's worth going back to 2022. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of those people calling for Liz Cheney and those folks that voted to impeach Donald Trump to be ousted. But in so many ways, that is where in the last month she's acknowledged that she should have been better herself in the political discourse because she didn't speak out in the past years and allowed that sort of politics to play out. And now when it came directed her way, she was in the line of fire. And instead of just choosing not to even run, she's just leaving Congress altogether on January 5th.
Yeah, it'd be clear if anybody reads her statement or listens to the whole thing, she's not becoming a Democrat anytime soon. She had a lot of fire for Democrats and Democratic policies, too, but most of it seemed to be focused on Donald Trump and MAGA and House leadership. Vaughn, thanks a million for getting us kicked off. An hour ago, you and I were not planning to talk, but I'm always happy that we do. Vaughn Hilliard for us.
Thanks, my friend. Be good.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, today was a wild day at the White House. Donald Trump brought New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani to the White House. It seemed like it was set up to be an ambush. Now, the White House clearly planned to sandbag the guy like they did with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this year. Remember that? In fact, when announcing the visit itself, Trump called Mamdani a communist, and his administration handpicked the White House pool and stocked it with right-wing cranks and influencers. Republicans even held a previously scheduled show vote on the floor today for a resolution condemning socialism ahead of Mamdani's visit. Fox News had tons of coverage of how the whole thing would go down.
In a way, they both sort of need each other politically as well, right? So President Trump going into the midterms, you look at today's vote in the House brought on a resolution condemning socialism. That's no doubt going to be seen between now and the 2026 midterms.
Well, do they need each other politically? I don't really know. I don't think the president's going to be reaching out to Mamdani.
No, I mean they need each other to be like the leverage points against each other because of the extremes.
Yes. Well, that's right.
Well, it's not quite right. At least it's not quite how it all went down. The President of the United States was undeniably charmed by the 34-year-old Democratic socialist. And to be clear, Mamdani didn't suck up to Trump. He stayed upbeat and relentlessly on message, as he has for the entire length of his mayoral campaign. Trump just seemed to genuinely like the guy.
We've just had a great meeting, a really good, very productive meeting. We have one thing in common. We want this city of ours that we love to do very well. And I wanted to congratulate the mayor. He really ran an incredible race against, a lot of smart people, starting with the early primaries against some very tough people, very smart people. And he beat them easily. And I congratulated him. And we talked about some things in very strong common, like housing and getting housing built and food and prices. The better he does, the happier I am, I will say. There's no difference in party. There's no difference in anything. And we're going to be helping him to make everybody's dream come true, having a strong and very safe New York. And congratulations, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, if you're seeing that for the first time because you were working today, yes, your reaction right now that you're having right now is the reaction of everyone who is watching this, okay? And then once Trump opened things up for questions, he actually ended up running interference for Mamdani from some of the very same right-wing people he had invited to grill Mamdani.
Mr. President, Republican Elise Stefanik has campaigned multiple times by calling Zohran Mamdani a jihadist. Do you think you're standing next to a jihadist right now in the Oval Office?
No, I don't, but she's out there campaigning and you know, you say things sometimes in a campaign.
You used to call New York City home. Would you feel comfortable living in New York City under a Mamdani administration?
Yeah, I would. I really would, especially after the meeting. Absolutely.
Just days ago, you referred to President Trump as a despot who betrayed the country. You said you would be his worst nightmare and accused him of having a fascist agenda. Are you planning to retract any of these remarks in order to improve your relationship?
I think both President Trump and we are very clear about our positions and our views.
I've been called much worse than a despot, so it's not that insulting. Maybe I think he'll change his mind after we get to working together.
Are you affirming that you think President Trump is a fascist?
I've spoken about.
That's okay. You can just say yes.
Okay.
So,
All right.
Okay. It's easier. It's easier than explaining it. I don't mind.
It's okay. You can just say, yes, I'm a fascist. Okay. Yeah, where were we? What? And going into this meeting, it always seemed plausible that Trump would wind up liking Mamdani. I mean, the mayor-elect perfectly fits the mold. He is a telegenic winner. He's got clear star power. He is, in one of Trump's favorite words, hot right now. But I don't think anyone expected the president to be quite so effusive, and Fox News was pretty clearly stunned.
I think J.D. Vance is jealous. I think the president wants to use him as a running mate. They really got along fantastic.
It was a surprise to see those two getting along as well as they did. A couple of times I asked the mayor-elect a tougher question, and the president almost helped him dodge it.
This was a love fest. It's a respect fest.
A respect fest. Now, Mayor-elect Mamdani is the one who requested the meeting, but I think it was the Trump administration that hoped to co-opt some of his credibility. I mean, Mamdani's whole deal, the driving force behind this successful and truly improbable campaign, has been, as you've heard 1,000 times now, the issue of affordability. And the first time, remember this, the first time many New York voters outside of his district heard of Mamdani was when he shared this video online basically exactly a year ago. And it was just a week after the election. And he went and spoke to voters in working class communities of color where Trump had overperformed, where he gained a huge vote share. And when asked why, the answer was clear: affordability.
The swing is because people want lower prices. They probably believe that Trump would give them that.
Market price, all around. Energy, gas.
La comida.
Food. Most of these people are working families. They're working 1 to 2, 3 jobs, and rent is expensive. Foods are going up. Utility bills are up.
And that's your hope, to see a little bit more of an affordable life?
Absolutely.
Now, that insight was key for a number of reasons. First, it was a proof of concept that running a campaign nearly singularly focused on the cost of living could be a successful strategy, both for Mamdani, who, again, was polling at 1%, and also we've seen Democrats nationwide, but also, and this is really important, because it completely undermines the Trump administration's entire theory of why they won. During the campaign and its immediate aftermath, Donald Trump knew that affordability was his best issue. Remember how much he talks about groceries, like he invented the term? And there's him posing with some Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Since then, everyone seems to have forgotten about it entirely in the Trump administration. The new theory that was adopted by Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and parroted all too often in the press, even before all the votes were counted a year ago, was that the election was actually a referendum on right-wing culture war, that Americans hated wokeness and they wanted to own the libs and they were mad at COVID restrictions and had enough of trans people. And the White House insisted the median voter basically had the politics of Stephen Miller. That was always total nonsense. Donald Trump won by 1.5 points because a relatively small number of voters in the overall pool of voters moved from one column to the other over the fact that stuff costs too much money. At this point, a year out, that's about as clear as day. That was Zohran Mamdani's central insight. Exactly a year ago today, basically. Trump, by contrast, has refused to learn the lesson of last year's election. He has done nothing on the cost of living. In fact, he has made the problem much worse with his unilateral tariffs. So now, nearly a year into this administration, J.D. Vance has to go out and beg the voters to be patient.
We understand that there's a lot more work to do. And the thing that I'd ask for the American people is a little bit of patience. This economy was not harmed in 10 months.
A little bit of patience. Why don't you guys hold your horses? Cool down a little bit. We're going to get there. Now, Donald Trump repeatedly promised to bring down prices on day one, and not just lower the rate of increase, like bring them down. Everything would be solved right away. But the economy's worse than when he took over. The administration is spiraling. Trump's approval ratings are cratering. His own party's starting to buck him. And each day he inches closer and closer to being a complete and total lame duck. So today, the oldest man ever elected president invited the 34-year-old Democratic Socialist to the Oval Office and lavished praise on him and started talking about affordability. He even took to social media later in the day to post about what a great honor it was meeting Zohran Mamdani, the new mayor of New York City. He included 4 photos of the men together in various parts of the White House, and even this shot of Mamdani alone in front of a portrait of FDR, a truly improbable, hilarious, full-circle moment for this administration and the formerly obscure figure now standing, smiling in the Oval Office.
This is our original reporting on those newly released emails from the deceased sex trafficker. So we turn to how Epstein tonight, who had used money and politically connected lawyers to duck the worst charges in his original sex crime case, how he continued that playbook. And that was clear, even as the legal walls closed in those final couple years before he was arrested, things looked tough. His legal team did change over time, but he continued to keep up with the 2 lawyers you see here, Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz. And they brought more than courtroom experience. They had links to the very top of the government and business elites who run large parts of this country. The new emails shed more light on how Epstein and Starr seemed very close. They met regularly. Starr was at times a professional where Epstein had been his client, a paid lawyer, but he also was noticeably warm. We see in these emails he signed them hugs and love. A cuddly rhetorical side of Starr that was not his public persona. He was, politicos will remember, the special counsel who went after President Clinton and later represented Trump in his impeachment defense, as you see here. So did Dershowitz. So think about just that before I read you more emails. Epstein managed to tap 2 lawyers who would later represent the very president who oversaw the DOJ that indicted Epstein. And we have a lot of contemporaneous evidence from that time that Epstein viewed part of his planned defense as having these type of elites who might prevent or corruptly intercede in the legal justice and accountability that he might otherwise face. That's, by the way, one of the reasons so many people in the public domain who haven't read every email get the gist of this and are skeptical of government elites continuing secrecy when they know the rules are not enforced equally. Now, the activities in these emails stretched beyond court and into Epstein's fixation on redeeming his public reputation. That was a theme we reported for you earlier in the week in those Bannon emails, where the Trump vet was openly saying he wanted to help Epstein's media rehab tour. Well, here, in the new emails I'm reading to you, Epstein links with star Trump author Michael Wolff, who had that big hit book he was writing about the Trump presidency. Starr writes, with thanks to Jeffrey, I'm delighted to come into your orbit. Now, then there was a public push where Epstein, who began his relationship with Starr and Dershowitz in that first Florida case, which was the first legal crack in the Epstein facade in 2006. Now, this is relevant to the later emails. They were key to securing a sweetheart plea deal back then. It was resolved a couple of years after the filing, around 2008. And Starr was using connections to be Epstein's, quote, fixer, according to that acclaimed reporting by Miami Herald journalist Julie K. Brown. Remember, it was her expose with her team that actually sparked the new probes of Epstein. So here's a 2018 email from Starr where they are discussing trying to rebut the criticism of that, quote, sweetheart deal. They were preparing an op-ed that defends Epstein and argues critiquing the resolution of a long-ago case involving our former client and now friend, Jeffrey Epstein. They go on to say the critique is profoundly misplaced, and the draft article goes on from there. Now, Starr says former client there. We don't have all the information on when Starr, now deceased, stopped formally representing Epstein or taking his money. It is notable that he said they had become friends. That is certainly not the case of every lawyer who is involved in defending people from heinous accusations or charges. And we can all recognize people have a right to legal defense. But as I will show you tonight, some of this went beyond that courtroom defense. And these are individuals who were clearly attractive to Epstein, not just because they were accredited lawyers, but because of their long political history, the kind of people who could call the top of the DOJ or even higher, maybe pick up a call to the donors and the White House officials and even a president who runs everything. The history of power is what Epstein wanted to exploit.
You ever socialized with Donald Trump in the presence of females under the age of 18?
I'm going to have to assert my 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment rights, sir. Were there young women in another part of the house giving massages when I wasn't around? I have no idea of that.
If a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo.
The president, in the course of those efforts, misused his authority and his power as president.
Presidential impeachment was truly a measure of last resort.
When it comes to Trump, all the president's men there were also all the sex traffickers' men. That's who they represented. That's what they did. Now, I want to again emphasize that impeachment was later. Both of those lawyers were retained by President Trump after the Epstein history. But again, their representation of Epstein was public. So make of that choice what you will. And there is still judgment when you're talking about who a president hires. I'd be the first and the last to remind everyone, legal counsel is a right in America, not a choice, not something to be bartered away when someone faces a big enough accusation. Everyone is entitled to that right, Mr. Epstein and Mr. Trump both. But the president's choice there may speak volumes, and we will see if we get the rest of the evidence to understand who he chose. Another 2017 email from a journalist who had worked for the New York Times prior suggests Epstein hired Starr, saying he was fielding questions about why Epstein hired Starr, meaning we, again, are following whether that so-called friendship also still involved being paid. A New York Times 2019 op-ed notes Jeffrey Epstein's current and former lawyer is assigned by Starr, but he doesn't appear to be on his official defense team in that July 2019 case. That's the case brought by the Trump DOJ, where, of course, Epstein ultimately died in prison before trial. Dershowitz said in late 2018 he was still advising Epstein. Now, Epstein was cultivating these relationships with people, not just, again, for legal skills, but with their proximity to power, and specifically Trump. Starr's not accused of wrongdoing here. He has died. Alan Dershowitz has denied any wrongdoing, and we played a clip of him discussing that if there was something going on over there, he says he did not know about it. Epstein also wrote during a text exchange that CIA Director Brennan's description of Trump as drunk with power seems apt. And then he adds, any thought on who he might at least listen to seriously? Ken Starr, Kissinger, Hannity. A reply to Epstein said, Hannity, maybe. Now here's another email where you see Epstein wants advice on responding to news that the DOJ would be reviewing the old plea deal. Quote, continue to ignore? Ann Coulter, Hannity, attack op-ed, not my skill set. He's asking, what about the penning something, it's a word there that we don't know who he might mean, something that suggests indignation and lays out some of the facts. And then you have Bannon, who we've been seeing advise him on the media side, says, well, that drives it a week. Epstein bemoaned how Senator Sass, Ben Sass, called him a, quote, child rapist. What about Ken talking directly to him? We believe, by inference, that would be this Ken Starr. Bannon says, won't help, but yes. Epstein was worried about how MAGA and prominent people were identifying him this way, which would, of course, not help his argument that somehow the DOJ should back down under Trump. He was scrambling for rehab. And when Bannon was advising him, we have a Trump official there, or ex-Trump official, who clearly was trying to help. There's also some evidence that consultants, as we reported, wanted to distort what would be the actual results from reality and Google. Of course, Google's debatable, but it's a place people look. They were trying to strengthen other friendly websites they call assets and push down the reports of his factual sex crime conviction. Starr was involved in a 2018 Epstein exchange where there was a text to an associate considering op-ed by Starr and Dershowitz. Law Review article, will hire PR, have to think with the group on the way forward. That is context for Starr sending the draft op-ed I mentioned at the top. It defends Epstein at his request. Indeed, the question about the friend reference is, was Starr, having benefited in the past or recently from payment by Epstein, was he trying to somehow use more credibility to claim this was a, view of a friend rather than paid work? And there is a PR expert named Matthew Hiltzik in these emails who says, think there should be a line in there somewhere which clearly confirms that J.E., presumably Epstein, his initials, understands and recognizes that he did something wrong. Imagine that. And I don't mean to laugh like it's funny, more like it's sad that it took the PR person to tell all these other guys, hey, do we ever want to mention he knows it was wrong? Epstein and Starr discussed Trump's involvement in the Mueller probe, Russian interference. Epstein telling an associate who's not named here that he spent the morning with Starr. The person asked, how bad a shape does he think DJT is in? Epstein recounts Starr told him Mueller's case isn't strong enough. That's an interesting view from someone who, of course, had been a special counsel himself, a rarefied group. He argues no evidence of corruption. Person replies, epic. Trump clear on Mueller if that's the case. Again, we're seeing deep inside the way these people communicate in ways we never normally would. If any three of these emails leaked out of the blue, it'd be front page New York Times. When 20,000 leak, it's hard to keep track of them all. Epstein replies, the issues will be the related financial ones. Trump, of course, has faced questions and legal cases about how he's handled finances the better part of his career. Some involved allegations of civil fraud, that case on appeal. The communication continued even when the feds closed in. Months before the arrest that would lead to his in-custody death, Epstein sent his legal team and Starr this link to a Miami Herald video of Bill Barr, who was going to be potentially Attorney General, who was saying in public he would look into the handling of the Epstein case. Now, knowing what we know about Epstein, that fits his MO of trying to use powerful people, not just to get his case heard or get an op-ed published or have a lawyer defend him in court, which, as I mentioned, is his legal right. No, it was the building, combined with allegations of blackmail that Pam Bondi said she's not going to look into, of a larger question that haunts, obviously, those officials I mentioned, but also past administrations, people in both parties, of whether beyond his legal right for representation, there was interference, malfeasance, or threats to try to get the feds to back off him.
Now I've seen everything. Hi again, everybody. You've been watching Donald Trump fall in love with New York City's mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani in the Oval Office after a meeting with high stakes for the country's largest city. The two men have, before just now, lobbed vicious verbal attacks at one another frequently. Mamdani, in his victory speech earlier this month, told Trump, quote, to get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us. Today, it was an alternate reality, completely different story. The two men struck a cordial tone initially, talking about lowering the cost of living for New Yorkers, and it got more affectionate on Trump's part, at least, as it went on. When pressed by journalists on whether he had called Donald Trump a fascist, Mamdani said yes, he did. Trump, for his part, who was sitting next to him, said, go ahead, you can answer the question. It's okay. This extraordinary meeting is where we start today. With me at the table, host of Politics Nation, president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton's here. He spoke with the mayor-elect ahead of this meeting yesterday. We can ask him exactly what he told him to drop into Donald Trump's Diet Coke. Also joining us, the host of Fast Politics, New York Times contributing opinion writer and political analyst Molly Jong-Fast is here. Also joining us, Puck News senior political columnist, MS Now National Affairs analyst John Heilman is here. Rev, what was the plan and what do you think?
Well, I talked to the mayor-elect last night. He called me and I told him that I've dealt with Donald Trump 40 years. He will either be very cordial and charming and may attack you on Truth Social before you get out of the grounds of the White House, or he may use it as a confrontation. That you should keep your eye on what it is you're trying to do. in terms of affordability, in terms of representing segments of New York that have been neglected, and don't bite the bait. Because I think that it's clear that Donald Trump will go either way that he thinks is to his advantage. I mean, we just sat here and saw him, in effect, attack his future gubernatorial candidate's characterization of Mamdani. That's going to be one of the headlines. Trump says he's not a jihadist. I mean, there'll be many.
Fox News covers three things with Trump down at 33%. They cover crime in America's cities. Right. They cover really two things. They cover immigration, but that's pretty unpopular right now, too. And they cover this line, this lie, this smear that New York's mayor-elect is a jihadist. What are they going to do now?
They're either going to have to attack Donald Trump or find a new script. And I think he did a lot of things, in he being President Trump, that was interesting. How New York had gone down. Well, I thought he said under Eric Adams everything was fine, and that he and Eric were working together. He threw everybody in front of the bus. But again, Zohran Mamdani is not off the grounds yet. Don't think that Donald Trump dates. He does not get married politically. And they had a good date. That does not mean this is a political marriage. I hope, though, it benefits the city of New York. I'm glad that we're not talking about him sending Vice in here and doing what he did in L.A. I think that's the positive. But would I bet on this sticking? Only because I know Donald Trump, I wouldn't bet on that.
I have never watched a public meeting, even with Putin, Trump didn't go on for as long, where he lavished that much praise, affection, and admiration on anyone.
So I have a theory that some of what's happened is that Donald Trump sees how popular Zohran is, and he wants to get on that affordability train, right? He sees his numbers. He knows inflation is plaguing him. I mean, maybe I'm ascribing too much sort of political acumen to him, but I just wonder, because when he was talking, he said, you know, many Bernie Sanders voters voted for me. And then you had Zohran go back and say, you know, they voted for him. You know, a lot of people in New York City voted for him. Yeah. And then he said more people voted for me. You know, I just wonder if I mean, look, obviously he really did clearly like him. And I think that it speaks to the talent, the raw political talent that Zohran has, that he can go in and sit there and just make this guy his greatest cheerleader. But I also wonder if he's trying to get on that, you know, he ran as a populist. He said he was going to make things cheaper.
We're ascribing to Trump like a multi-step process when all that we've ever witnessed is like a hunting dog's reflexes. Right. And I just think there was a winner in the Oval Office today who won something that Donald Trump just told us he'd always wanted. Donald Trump said, quote, one of the things I would love to be is mayor of New York. And this is someone who won. Again, we'll quote Donald Trump today on this. He came out of nowhere, and Trump was obviously tracking his poll numbers. So Trump is endorsing Cuomo, is flipping Adams or whatever the hell he did with the Adams criminal bribery case at DOJ. And I wonder how all those lawyers feel about ruining their integrity to spring Adams when Trump was obviously in love with Mamdani the whole time. And he's tracking his polls. He says you were at 1 and then 4 and then 9. He's obviously been following his meteoric rise. And the guy is sitting there saying, you can call me a fascist or a despot. You just answered the question. I mean, I've never seen him sort of care for his children, his vice president, or his cabinet's credibility the way he seemed committed to honoring Mamdani's credibility.
No, I've never seen him do that before. But Donald Trump is one that likes a political athlete.
Winner. Right.
And a winner. I mean, back when sometime we would get along, I would sit at ringside at boxing matches because he had the license in Atlantic City. He would go in rooting for one boxer, and if another guy got ahead in the third round, he was rooting for him. He's going to walk out of the place with the winner. And Mamdani won.
Should like J.D. Vance get some moving boxes?
Exactly. Yeah. But I think what is critical here, let's not forget, is that Trump changed a position on Mamdani. Mamdani did not change what he was saying he wanted to do in the city. And I think what a lot of us were looking for is whether Mamdani, even when they asked questions, well, what are you saying about Trump? He said people voted for affordability. Some of them voted for Trump. You did not see Mamdani become the guy that changed
at all.
his script at all. It was all Trump. And so I could say from having talked to Mamdani several times, including last night, that he held the line on what he said. It's Donald Trump that changed the script, and he did so rightfully. He ought to be working with the mayor of New York. He ought to be talking like this. I just don't know how long it will last. But I think that Zohran Mamdani did not change anything other than he was cordial to a man who had called him everything but a child of God, and he had no reason to confront him because Donald Trump said, no, he's not a jihadist. No, he's going to do great things. No, he's going to be a great mayor. This is a guy who said, let's vote to save the city, to vote for somebody else.
Hi.
I'll tell you a little.
I just have to say, I've covered Donald Trump for 9 years. This might be one of my favorite live Trump events I've ever covered. One of the greatest
I gotta
things
say, just to think back on over the course of our week, if I had asked you all a week ago what was more likely, that Donald Trump would capitulate on the Epstein files and would urge everyone to vote for the discharge petition, and that Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert would stand up to all those things, you would have said, oh, that's pretty unlikely, John. What's less likely, that or this Mamdani thing? It would have been a stumper. You know, that Trump would end up having a love fest with Mamdani. Would be like, oh my God, I don't know which one of those is like. I often tell the story of my first encounter with Trump when he decided to run for Trump. And I've been fighting on Twitter for years and years and years. He decided to run for president. The day after he announced for president, I was at Trump Tower. I came back, we covered it on live television. I tweeted out a thing that said, everybody who thinks that Donald Trump can't win the Republican nomination, you should think twice, because the Republican Party is becoming more racist, more xenophobic, more populist, more this, more that. Trump tweeted back, at Jay Hiles finally started to understand Donald Trump. And I really was like, oh, he's binary. Like, at that moment, there were all these political reporters and correspondents and analysts saying he can't win. And it didn't matter why I said. I could have said.
You said he could win because people are becoming as racist as
but
he
it didn't matter. If I had said the whole country is secretly in the Ku Klux Klan, that's why he could win, he would have been like, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Because winner, loser.
That's right.
Your thing at the binary, at any moment, there's you're with me or against me. You think I can win at that, winner.
Yeah.
Zohran Mamdani, in 2024, Donald Trump was on the presidential ballot here because he ran for president, right? In New York City, he won 786,000 votes. In a presidential election year, 786,000 votes. Zohran Mamdani won more than 1 million votes the other day. That, in Donald Trump's mind, is a very simple scorecard.
Right.
That guy, he looks like that guy goes, he's a winner. He's a winner. And I don't think any of it guarantees anything, because you will recall, after the election in 2016, he sat there in the Oval Office with Barack Obama.
Yeah.
They didn't have a love fest like this, but it was cordial. And Trump came out afterwards and said he really liked Obama. He thought Obama was really good. He said all kinds of nice things about Obama. Not like this, because he was just coming in, but they had a very cordial meeting. And now, as you know, Donald Trump has been trying to investigate Barack Obama ever since. Right. 2 months from now, we could be in a totally different place. But right now, Trump is feeling like weak and like a loser. Zohran Mamdani is a winner, and he wants to be in that.
I was about to say,
I agree with you. I'm saying 2 days, 2 months, 2 weeks, who knows? None of it means anything except for today. But today, Donald Trump is on his heels this week, and Zohran Mamdani is on the opposite of what your heels are, on his toes. He's like, I just want to sit here and like bask around in the warm glow of winter right now, because he's probably feeling not very winnerish at the moment.